So let's talk about Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching as we turn our focus to Taoism. At a used bookstore several years ago, I was in college at the time, I picked up a copy of The Tao is Silent by Raymond Smullyan. And I just picked it up on a whim. I'd heard of Taoism and I'd heard of the Tao, and I was intrigued by this little bit of information that I had. I had not heard of the Tao Te Ching. But as I read Smullyan's book, I gained a great appreciation for Taoism's philosophy, as he interpreted it, of course. About halfway through the book, a friend came for a visit, and he saw the book. And I was at a very conservative Christian college at the time, so to have a book on Taoism might have been a little suspect. My friend's jaw dropped and his eyes got wide, and he said, "Are you into the Tao?" Well, I replied, I like what I've read. "Have you read the Tao Te Ching?" he said. "No, but and before I could finish the sentence, he dashed out of the house and slammed the door. So, I'd never noticed a manic tendency in my friend before, but I didn't know quite how to interpret this peculiar behavior. So, before I could wonder about it too much, the door, he just burst in through the door again, and he was hovering in the doorway with this large dog-eared paperback clutched to his chest, and he came to me and he pressed it against my chest, and he said, "This is the holy word of God." "You don't say," I said. And I started flipping through the book, and it was Jane English and Guy Fu Fang's translation of the Tao Te Ching with the beautiful black and white nature photography. You might have seen it. And I asked him if I could borrow it. And he chewed his lip for a minute and didn't answer. And I got my first glimpse of just how really important this book was to him. And I said, it won't take long for me to read it, and I'll bring it right back to you, I promise. And turns out I lied, because I I had a hard time parting with it. From the first few chapters, I was absolutely entranced with this book, with its simplicity, with its awesome profundity. And I have to say that living with this book has seriously affected my life, both spiritually and socially as well. And I'm not the only person either. The Tao Te Ching is the most translated book in the world, except for the Bible. So, what is this amazing book? Why is it so meaningful to me and so many other people? And why has it been for such a very long time? The Tao Te Ching is a book of Chinese philosophical poetry. It was written sometime between the 7th and 4th centuries BCE. Now, according to tradition, it was written by a quiet librarian by the name of Lao Tzu, which in Chinese can mean, curiously enough, old man or old child. Lao Tzu was said to be a contemporary Confucius, although he was older than Confucius by all accounts. And the legend of their ideological rivalry was very, very popular. And in fact, Chuang-Tzu reports on it. It's said that both of their reputations traveled before them, so that when they finally met face to face, Lao Tzu was anything but impressed. Instead of praising Confucius, he sternly rebuked him for his arrogance and greed and ambition. And when the audience was over, Confucius is recorded as having said, "I understand how birds can fly, how fishes can swim, how four-footed beasts can run, Those that run can be snared. Those that swim can be caught with hook and line. Those that fly can be shot with arrows. But when it comes to the dragon, I am unable to conceive how he can soar into the sky, riding upon the wind and the clouds. Today I have seen Lao Tzu, and I can only liken him to a dragon. Scholars nowadays actually doubt the historicity of the person Lao Tzu, and many people believe the Tao Te Ching is a book that is merely attributed to him, but in fact that it is a composite work collected by an early Taoist school. Now, whether Lao Tzu actually wrote every word of the Tao Te Ching, whether he actually existed, or whether it was a composite work is kind of unimportant. Most probably, he is the founder of a school, and the teachings of which are best represented by this particular book. He is, nevertheless, its traditional author, and so for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to give him the credit. In the Tao Te Ching, we encounter a form of nature mysticism that's actually not very far removed from native traditions, and yet it has a unique and amazing form. As in native traditions, in Taoism, humans are not seen as separate from or dominant over nature. We are, in fact, a part of nature. The Taoist sees him or herself as equal to everything else in creation. And in fact, it's from observing nature that wisdom is gleaned. There is no revelation in Taoism. Nature reveals everything we need to know, if only we have the eyes and the patience to see it. There's nothing in the Tao Te Ching that needed to be revealed from some supernatural force. In other words, there's nothing in the Tao Te Ching that you could not discover for yourself by simply sitting down, watching nature, paying attention. Which is kind of an amazing source for a scripture. Nature in Taoism is always correct, and it has the answers to every problem. Humans, well, we think too much, and that's what gets us into trouble. So, let's talk about the Tao. Just what is the Tao? It's not as easy a question as it sounds. And Lao Tzu tells us right off in his very first poem in the Tao Te Ching that the Tao that can be described in words is not the true Tao. Like most mystics, however, he does not let the impossibility of this task deter him, and he spends the next 80 poems trying to do just that. Now, in the West, we're used to thinking of deity in terms of God or the gods. In fact, most places around the world, we are used to thinking of deity in terms of God or the gods, but Taoism really demands a very different kind of orientation. The Tao is not a god ruling over subjects or wielding power over nature. The Tao is just a part of nature, or more accurately, nature is a part of the Tao. And therefore, the Tao is not a separate personality like most native gods or like the Jewish or Christian god. The Tao is impersonal. Now, this might sound like a negative thing to some people, but it's really not. It is an impersonal force that pervades all things and yet is as big as the universe. The universe is in fact contained within the Tao. And the Tao doesn't have a personality, or it's not anthropomorphized. It is simply the unfolding of all that is. So by observing nature, we can discern some characteristics about the Tao, and we can discern healthy ways of living our life within it. There's no one to pray to in Taoism, certainly not in the philosophical Taoism of Lao Tzu. In other forms of Taoism, such as the more shamanistic traditions in Taoism, it has merged with the native traditions, and so there are whole pantheons of gods and goddesses. And if you go to a Taoist temple, you will see that. But when you look at strictly philosophical Taoism, when you read the Tao Te Ching, when you read the Chuang Tzu, there aren't any gods. There's just the Tao. So there's no rites that need to be performed. There's no liturgy to be recited. There is simply the world as it is. And either we will find our proper place within the world, or we will suffer. Lao Tzu says, the great Tao flows everywhere, to the left and to the right. All things rely on it for their life, and it does not refuse them. When its work is done, it does not demand recognition. It clothes and nourishes all things, and does not demand allegiance. Since it makes no demands for itself, it can seem to be of small regard. Yet, as all things return to it of their own accord, without being commanded, it can truly be regarded great. It is only because it does not claim to be great that it is able to achieve such greatness. In another place, Lao Tzu says, the Tao gives birth to all things. Nature's goodness nurtures them. Matter forms them. Environment shapes them. Therefore, all things cannot help but to respect the Tao and treasure goodness. Respect for the Tao and the treasuring of goodness are not demanded of them. They do it naturally. So the Tao gives birth. Nature's goodness nurtures them, grows them, raises them, and enables them to mature, ripens them, nourishes, and shelters them. The Tao gives birth, but does not possess, acts, but does not take credit, guides, but does not control. This is the mystery of goodness. According to Lao Tzu, all things in nature are in balance. The Tao consists of both yin and yang, opposing forces that define and sustain each other. The Tao Te Ching speaks of an active force in nature, this is yang, but it also speaks of a restful force, or actually the absence of force in nature, and this is yin. And you can look at pretty much everything in the world in terms of the yang that it entails or the yin that it entails, the force or the acquiescence. This is symbolized by the tadpoles in the Taoist symbol that are chasing each other's tails. When we think about yin and yang, we often are tempted to think about opposites. So light and dark, well, that certainly makes sense because light would be yang, force, dark would be yin. Heat is yang, cold is yin. We might even think of metaphysical concepts like matter being yang and spirit being yin, if we wanted to mix our apples and oranges a little bit. Some people are tempted to jump to good and evil, but that doesn't really work, because good and evil, according to Taoism, are human judgments, and they don't really have any existence outside of the human imagination. Things just are. They're not good, they're not bad, they just are. They only become good or bad when human beings label them so. The Tao Te Ching says, when people see beauty as beautiful, They recognize other things as ugly. When people see goodness as good, they recognize other things as being bad. Therefore, existence and non-existence produce one another. Difficult and easy achieve each other. Long and short define each other. High and low rely on each other. Voice and accompaniment harmonize with one another. Front and back follow each other. These opposites include being, yang, or non-being, yin. Again, very similar to our ideas about matter and spirit. Lao Tzu presents non-being as being absolutely necessary for physical realities to function, and vice versa, when he says, 30 spokes join together at one hub, but it is the hole in the center that makes it operable. Clay is molded into a pot, but it is the emptiness inside that makes it useful. Doors and windows are cut to make a room, but it is the empty spaces that we use. I got to tell you, the first time that I read those words, chills ran down my spine. I felt I had been told a great secret that was the most obvious thing in the world. This description of the relationship between matter and spirit, that one is not dominant, that they need each other. Existence and non-existence produce one another, Lao Tzu explains in poem 11. Existence is what we have, but non-existence is what we use. Now, in addition to non-being, which is thing or noun-oriented, Lao Tzu also offers a matching concept which is action or verb-oriented, something he calls non-action. The Chinese word for this is wu wei. Wu wei literally means not doing, but it has many applications. With this concept, Lao Tzu seems to be speaking directly to the 21st century Westerners and our fast-paced cultures. Because it doesn't just mean not doing as in just sit there. It means don't force things. Don't strive. Don't try to make things go against their natures. And that includes us. Lao Tzu says, if you spend your life filling your senses and rushing around doing things, you are going to be beyond hope. Instead, Lao Tzu asks us a difficult question. He says, when heaven gives and takes away, can you be content to just let things come or go? And even when you understand all things, can you simply allow yourself to be? There's that old joke that reminds us, us Westerners, us Westerners, we say, don't just sit there, do something. And while Eastern wisdom says, don't just do something, sit there. And it's kind of like that. The value of not doing, according to Lao Tzu, is every bit as great as the value of non-being. And the health of our non-being, our spirit, is utterly dependent upon our ability to not do, or to not strive, to not force, to not push. So, wu wei, not doing, doesn't mean that I don't do anything. It just means I don't do anything that is contrary to my nature. So, for instance, I am a teacher. It's part of who I am and my very nature. But if I were to try to be an accountant or a lawyer, that would be very frustrating. That would be forcing. That would be doing something completely contrary to my nature, and I would suffer because of it. However, teaching or pastoring, which is one of my other jobs, that comes naturally. That's not like work. That's like playing. So these are things that I want to do, that I crave to do, in fact. And so it's not doing because it's not forcing. It's not striving. Because when we strive, we suffer. Let's talk about leadership. In the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu really concerns himself greatly with this question of leadership, both political and spiritual. There's a tradition that the Tao Te Ching was originally written as a guide for a young ruler on how to rule well. Lao Tzu's advice is about as counterintuitive as we in the West can possibly imagine. He says, loving all people and leading them well, can you do this without imposing your will? Let's ask that question at a presidential debate sometime. Coercion, Lao Tzu insists, is contrary to the Tao. The key to being successful in leadership, according to Lao Tzu, is to not try. Therefore, the sage, not trying cannot fail, says Lao Tzu. Not clutching, she cannot lose. The truly good person does not try to be good. Goodness needs to come naturally, effortlessly, like breathing or hearing. The sage isn't really concerned with being good, or even with being a good leader. He or she doesn't give it a thought. It's not a goal. The goal is to respond humanely, to respond as a human would to whatever situation life gives. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I was at work, and I was just out of college, and I was working in an office in San Francisco, and my coworker was a Chinese grandmother named Agnes. And I was sitting at my desk agonizing over some minor indiscretion, something I might have said to somebody that might have offended them. And Agnes had enough of it. She just snapped, and she threw down the papers that she was carrying, and she pointed her finger in my face, and she said, "You are too goody two-shoes. If you were Chinese, we would take you to the doctor." I was shocked. But now, after reading the Tao Te Ching, I finally understand her. When things are in balance, when the yin and yang, the force and the acquiescence in our lives are in balance, we're healthy. When they get out of balance, we get sick. All of Chinese medicine is based on this same principle. And it's certainly healthier than constantly berating yourself for not being good enough. Because according to the Tao, if you're too good, you're just not healthy. Because that's not how human beings are. We all contain a mixture of selfishness and altruism. And that's actually the way we're supposed to be built. And if one of those gets out of balance, if we become too selfish or too altruistic, it's actually bad for us, and we get sick. Either we get sick or our social structures get sick. Either way, finding that balance is what the Tao is concerned with. So Taoism, not surprisingly, has a very different concept of what we might call in the West sin. So sin in Taoism isn't about doing evil or disobeying authority. Instead, it's simply going against the grain. And one's punishment isn't otherworldly, it is immediate, and it is this world. Because if you go against the grain, if you go against your own nature, if you go against the way that the Tao wants to flow in the world and in your life, then you're going to suffer. You're going to have a life that is stressful and full of struggle. Salvation, on the other hand, to use another Western word, is simply going with the flow. Because if we go with the flow, we find a life of freedom and security that is deliciously free of stress, because we know how the universe works and we can cooperate with it. There's no guilt language in the Tao Te Ching. The Tao's love is universal and unconditional. It's not for people who are, it's not only for people who are enlightened. It's not only for people who are holy. It's not even for people who are moral. The Tao is there for everybody. Lao Tzu writes, "It is the good person's treasure and the bad person's refuge." Why did the sages of old value the Tao so much? He asks. Because when you seek, you find, and when you sin, you are forgiven. How cool is that? And in Lao Tzu's philosophy, success comes not from achievement or from the accumulation of spiritual merit or power. Instead, success is measured by one's ability to simply be. Free of stress, free of striving, free of conceptions of what one should be that is in any way at odds with how one simply is. Legend tells us that Lao Tzu, in his old age, finally despaired of teaching humanity anything, and he gave up on us as a lost cause. He packed his yak and he headed for the wilderness where things were sane. He came to the top of a mountain pass, which was the last outpost of civilization, and the gatekeeper there persuaded Lao Tzu to commit his philosophy to paper before he left humankind forever. And the human race will forever be indebted to the foresight of this gatekeeper, because Lao Tzu's book, consisting of about 5,000 characters, is one of the most sublime and meaningful and downright practical works of mysticism in the entire human canon.